Welcome to Cryptoland. I'm Krishna Andavolu. We're talking about the energy-intensive industry of Bitcoin mining and what that means for the environment. Without question, crypto mining is booming anywhere anyone can get their hands on cheap electricity. Proponents think that this surge in demand will only help push our energy grids to be more green and stable. But is that just wishful thinking? Here to talk about it are Vice News' Alice Hines, Motherboard's Audrey Carleton, and data scientist and founder of Digiconomist Alex De Vries. Okay guys, thank you for joining me, first of all. There's a lot to go over, a lot of promises, lots of reality, but let's set the table by talking about why crypto mining, specifically Bitcoin mining, is so energy intensive. This is obvious, I suppose, to anyone who knows about this, but to at least have the same basis of understanding, let's talk about it for a second. Very simply, why is it that mining Bitcoin takes so much energy?
So Bitcoins can only be mined through this kind of solving this complex mathematical algorithm in which all of these ASICs or these specialized computers are trying to land on a string of numbers, sort of random numbers, and everybody's just kind of brute force doing it at one time, trying to guess these numbers, kind of like a lottery ticket, and only one person can get it at any given time. So there's a lot of attempts that fail, and some people characterize that as waste. Other people would say that this kind of secures the blockchain by having everybody kind of work at this all at one time together, but that's a lot of energy that goes at one attempt at creating something that only one mind can get.
Mm-hmm. So basically, like, the Bitcoin algorithm spits out a new blockchain every, few minutes or something?
It adds a new block to the chain every 10 minutes.
Okay, so then every 10 minutes, a whole bunch of people try to solve the new set of riddles together at the same time. The first person who does it gets the thing?
Yeah, that's they're right. Competing against each other, not working together. Yeah.
So they're competing against each other to get it, and most people are gonna get it wrong. That's just how it works. So one person gets it right, that's great, but because Bitcoin is worth so damn much, a lot of people are trying to get it.
Yes.
That's right.
Okay, I think I understand that. And then you could characterize it as waste because there's a lot of work that requires electricity that isn't actually netting a Bitcoin.
Yeah.
Right? So that would be, if you do a cost of transaction, then that goes really high. But then there is an argument where all these people doing it actually helps the system be really robust because everyone's trying to make a ledger entry.
Yeah, that's the whole point of it being a decentralized ledger, is that anybody can ostensibly participate in the system, and that no matter who ends up adding the block to the chain, it can be verified by everyone involved. So it makes it extra secure.
But proof of stake eliminates that. That's kind of the crucial difference there, is that proof of stake eliminates that extra waste, to my understanding, because rather than saying everybody go at this at once, it's somebody's chosen, also kind of in a lottery ticket style way. One person's chosen and they get the right to mine a coin in that moment, and their ability to be the person that's chosen, it is greater the more they have, the more stake they have in the game, the more coins they have. So you get rid of all of that waste because you don't have everybody working at it at once. You just kind of have one person who gets it.
I can just imagine like the first person who minted a coin, like digging out gold and like making it into a circle and stamping something on it, be like, this is now worth value. Listening to this conversation, be like, what the hell are you talking about?
Yeah, it's all in the ether. It's invisible.
My question to you, Alex, is like, is it a problem that Bitcoin takes so much electricity?
Well, there's multiple reasons why you can consider it a problem. And the first thing is that this network, which consists of roughly 2.9 million devices all around the world, consumes as much electrical energy as a country like Argentina in total. So it's a substantial amount. It's more than 0.5% of our global electricity consumption. But if you want to answer the question, is it a problem, then you need to look at what is that energy being used for. And as just explained, that's mostly for machines that are just generating gases all the time. It's the world's most environmentally expensive game of guess the number, and the only thing we get in return for that is a system that can at best do maybe 7 transactions per second, and that's it.
So it's a problem because of its scale, and because it's mostly failures, and every once in a while it gets it right.
Yes, it's because we're using energy to make effectively useless computations all the time, and we're not getting anything back but a system that cannot even do more than 0.02% of what our regular financial system is handling.
Right. Now that, Alice, cuts against... Okay, sorry, you want to say
Well,
something?
I kind of, while I was reporting this story, I did hear a different perspective, and arguably the fact that all of these computers are working on the same problem at once contributes to Bitcoin's use, because it's a decentralized ledger, and rather you have basically all of these different miners who are all trusting each other to be able to add a block to the chain, and that allows the currency to be self-regulating. It allows the currency to basically not have a Federal Reserve or a government which is, controlling how much money to print. So that is what Bitcoin proponents would say is part of the beauty of the system, that so many people are participating in it at once, anonymously, and you can trust each other.
And that's a proponent's line, but it also cuts to the heart of what blockchain currencies, cryptocurrencies are, which is a collective effort not mediated by a sovereign or someone with like a bunch of military power, but people with a bunch of computers. And so there's a culture around that. There's hope. There is a utopian vision. And I want to ask you, Alice, because you're in Texas, you were in Texas reporting this, because Texas has so much energy, but it's also just like a deregulated energy marketplace. So there must be some interesting cultural things happening when you have crypto folks who are like, yo, let's build a new world, coming to terms with a land of like, the Wild West of energy.
Yeah, the cultural mashup was really trippy. So you have, I was at this Bitcoin conference, and you have all of these people it's a blockchain conference, but a lot of people there are into Bitcoin. And yeah, so you have like flashy cars, you have like cowboy boots, but you have also everyone from a county judge to in West Texas who didn't know anything about it and has been forced to learn because this is now an industry that's coming to his region, and then to people from large banks and institutions who are now investing in cryptocurrency as part of their holdings. And so there's institutional investors as well. So it's a really interesting mashup. And what the people in Texas say is that the individual spirit of wanting to kind of make your fortune and being willing to risk a lot is something that unites crypto culture and Texas culture. Mm-hmm. So that's what the talking point was.
So it's like a bunch of mavericks trying to mine a bunch of coin.
Yeah, that's right. It's funny like how the mining metaphor has really just like continually being carried into the future for Texas.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So what I know about Texas is that the energy marketplace there is highly deregulated. Right. There's all kinds of different energy that could be found. I mean, gas, obviously, natural gas is a huge one, but there's regular oil as well. I imagine there's solar and wind, like the whole marketplace is there. Why does it matter that Texas has a deregulated energy marketplace?
It matters because energy is cheap in Texas, and crypto miners make their margins off of cheap energy. So that energy could be renewable, it could be natural gas, it could just be from making a deal with a grid operator like ERCOT and having basically an agreement that says you get energy at a certain rate below what homeowners and consumers and general businesses usually get. So basically it makes it easier to set up deals in Texas to get cheap energy.
It's supportive to the kind of like maverick innovation that miners love.
It's an economic draw. That's one of the big reasons why Texas is seeing a boom in crypto mining right now. It's hard to know exactly how it's going to pan out because it's also still in its infancy.
Right. Audrey, what do you think?
I think it's often conflated that that crypto mines can add generation to the grid, and that's sort of like the ethos of what I think Ted Cruz and some of these crypto people who adopt this mentality are trying to say, and that's not really the case. Like they're using a bunch of energy, and then when there's strain, they are giving it back. So it's sort of like a similar concept of people who have like smart thermometers in their homes, where it's like, you use this amount of energy all the time, but then when there's so much strain on a super hot day, it automatically turns your thermostat up or does whatever it can to get rid of load. And that just gives kind of energy capacity back to the grid. So these mines are not really generating energy for the grid, they're just using it all the time, and then when the grid needs it back, they're giving it back.
Yeah, and the fact of crypto's enormous energy consumption is a blessing and a curse here, because the fact of it being so large does actually impact the grid more to be able to have that leeway to work with when they do need the energy. But then at the same time, like on a constant level, like they're also using a ton of energy that if this industry didn't exist, could be used for other things. So yeah.
Hospitals, refrigerators, homes, things like that, yeah.
And we saw that in Texas this last year, where the grid basically failed as a result of a cold spell, right? So like, yeah, there's the possibility that you give back to the grid when it's needed, but it's still sucking to begin with.
Yes. Yeah, though correct me if I'm wrong, Audrey, but that blackout was not caused by, overall demand on the grid being high and maybe potentially going towards use cases that we don't think are worth it. It was based on infrastructure failure and also just everybody turning on their heaters all at once. So it's the spike that is causing the problem. And what the Bitcoin people say is that they flatten the spike, which...
Yeah.
Well, but you actually, let's key in on that, like uses that are worth it, right? We can sit around this table and be like, hey, Bitcoin is not a use case of electricity that's worth it when it's compared to a hospital or like a child care center or a senior center, right? Yeah. But from my understanding of like how the world works, like, people like us sitting around a table don't get to decide what's worth it and what isn't worth it. It's an amalgamation of everyone's individual interests, through government and regulation, but also just through individual actors who are entrepreneurial, who are trying shit out. And the basis here with crypto is like, we're trying shit out. So yeah, I can see the Ted Cruz model of like, oh, it's gonna save the grid, and say like, bullshit. But I can also play that back and say, well, gosh, it's a new industry. And yeah, they're talking points and some of them are bullshit, but there must be a core here of innovation, and that we're talking about it, that it produces value. And that core of innovation is both cultural, in that there are people who are trying to get like methane and shit, which I want to talk about in a second.
Yeah.
But talk to me about the core of innovation behind kind of like the crypto revolution, how it might come into these bigger problems that we're having about environment. Because it's not like these are people who are mining Bitcoin and saying, fuck the environment. They're trying to say, we're mining Bitcoin and we're really thinking about the environment, because these are two things that have to come together.
Well, I think fundamentally, like what most, and maybe this is a little reductive, but I think what most crypto miners are thinking about is how to lower their bottom line. And it just so happens that renewable energy is that wind and solar are the cheapest forms of energy to produce, and that naturally, in a state like Texas that does have so much wind capacity, that does naturally create the market conditions that incentivize a renewable build out. So, from a couple of different angles, that would incentivize crypto miners that want to make mines and build wind turbines explicitly to power their mines. It also incentivizes wind farms that have maybe extra load at given times and need something to do with it. And extra load meaning they generate too much energy and it's more than the grid needs. They need something to do with it. They don't have battery storage for it. So, hey, there's a local crypto miner who wants to contract with us. Let's give them our extra energy. So from a couple different angles, it does incentivize that. But I think the fundamental question, and this is more like a question of political belief, is like, should we leave the, Ted Cruz will say this is a great thing because it guides the renewable transition. Should we really be leaving our renewable transition to this like rogue industry that's pretty much, from my perspective, from many, I think, people's perspective, just always going to do what it takes to prioritize bottom line? Is in a state like Texas that does have fierce libertarian energy to it, and that's like a big part of the culture, then the answer is probably yes in most cases. But you would speak to advocates of like public power and who believe that our utilities should always be regulated by the government and energy should always be delivered by the government, and they would say absolutely not. I don't want the crypto industry anywhere near our renewables. So that innovation is like that. I think that is there, but it raises broader questions.
Alice, tell me about like capturing stray methane, like some of that kind of like, frankly, I'll say it, it's like pretty cool, right? That they're doing shit like that?
Yeah, I think basically what my takeaway was of looking at a few different ways of doing mining in Texas as part of this reporting was that it really just depends on what you're doing, because the energy makeup that some people are using are so different from others. And so what you're referring to, Krishna, is the mining rig that we saw in East Texas, where basically they have a trailer of these ASIC miners hooked up to a oil well. And so the natural gas that is coming out of that well, it could have been connected to a pipeline, but that pipeline was shut down years ago because it wasn't environmentally viable. And so what you have is these oil wells that are basically leaching methane into the air. And so that has I think it heats the air 85 times more than CO2 is the stat that I read. And so that's really disturbing that this is happening. And so what these kids, and I call them kids because they're 22, what they're doing is they actually they hook up a generator to that natural gas. They run it, and so it does output CO2, but it's a much lower carbon footprint than the methane that is being leached currently. Mm-hmm. And basically, this methane is waste, and so they're converting it into energy to run their Bitcoin mines. And it's a win-win because they have a really low cost of energy. So even if the price of Bitcoin goes down, because that is part of how this is all self-regulating, right? When the price of Bitcoin goes down, fewer people are going to mine because the energy costs are going to make it so that they're not profitable. These guys actually have super low energy costs because these Texas oil men are kind of who've had these mines for decades, have had these wells for decades. To them this is garbage. So they're basically selling it to these kids for pennies. And so that's actually kind of a cool use case, but it's just, from what I could see, there's not really any structures in place to make sure that is actually how mining is occurring versus the crazy economies of scale that we saw at a place like Riot Whinstone, where maybe they also say that they're doing things to that they're looking at how to make their energy use more renewable. But I mean, the fact remains that right now they're getting their energy from the grid. So sure, 35% of that is renewable because it's coming just straight from the energy makeup of the grid, but also 50% of that is natural gas. So and they are they're constructing more and more mining facilities. They're growing because you need to grow in order to become more competitive in the Bitcoin algorithm. That's just how it works.
I want to go to the big one again and talk to Alex about it because I'm sure he has a few things to say. But I do want to key in on how cool it is that you put a cap on a methane leak and it becomes value that somehow exists between a bunch of different people. It's more complicated than that. But if you take the way that natural extraction economies used to work, or still do work, is you take something out of the ground, you make it powers the creation of a product, and then someone buys that product, and it's in the arbitrage that you create some value, and then that value, you got banks involved, and the banks are able to hold that as debt, but then it becomes value itself, and all of a sudden value creates value, and we're sitting here and we don't have to be subsistence farmers, right? There's something cool about de-ambiguating all that and be we're going to take the gas and we're going to make the coin.
Well, that's how people who are Bitcoin evangelists kind of talk about it. They're sort of this is the next evolution of our economy, and I think I don't know how much we all want to buy into that, but it is kind of interesting to think about. I hear the word evolution a lot, the evolution of currency.
Alex, you've been waiting very patiently, so I want to get to you about this because, the huge rig that Alice was talking about seems dystopian to me, not exactly utopian.
Yes, well, I mean, the flare gas case is a very interesting case. What typically happens is that methane doesn't just leak away, it typically gets flared. And what these Bitcoin proponents are proposing is, well, instead of flaring it, let's use it to mine Bitcoins instead, so it does no harm. Now, in the US, the Environmental Protection Agency requires that flaring has a minimum combustion efficiency of 98%. So that means that most of the methane, even if it is flared, gets converted to CO2. So if you use it for Bitcoin mining instead, so you combust it and use it to power Bitcoin miners instead, then there is a small potential gain, but due to rules and regulations, not that much. And then the question is, whose problem are you really solving here? Because the environmental gain is really limited, and there's just not much possible gain at all. But you are making a byproduct of fossil fuel extraction more profitable. So you are definitely solving a problem of the fossil fuel industry. And you have to consider how this can potentially disincentivize more ambitious flare gas capture projects, because nowadays it is possible to have these projects that can actually reduce emissions up to 80%. So if you are using that gas to power a Bitcoin mine, then you might not be interested anymore in one of these more really environmentally beneficial projects. Same thing goes with renewable energy, by the way, because the interesting thing is that just last week in Sweden, the Financial Market Authority said that, hey, we want to ban proof of work mining in Sweden because they are using our renewables, and we don't find that it is, the social benefits of these cryptocurrencies are questionable. Of course, you can debate on that part, but the interesting thing is that they said, okay, we want to use our renewables to transition our more essential services, and we don't want to put it in Bitcoin instead, because then we still have to power the more essential services with fossil fuel. So in that sense, you're just displacing the problem rather than solving it.
Okay, so Audrey, you wanted to say something.
Yeah, I was just going to say, I think with the fossil fuels in Texas, it does sort of create this dangerous precedent that incentivizes the existence of these old wells that are flaring. And flaring is really dangerous and really bad, and it creates a lot of nuisance and a lot of disturbance, and getting rid of flaring is good. But the question is not, are we getting rid of, for me, it's like, should we be getting rid of flaring by turning that into, these coins that some people don't even think are real and are like totally illegitimate, and that's like a much broader question. Or should we get rid of flaring by getting rid of oil, by plugging old oil wells, capping oil wells, and like I read a report that said that something like 70 to 80% of flaring that goes on in Texas is unregulated, it's unpermitted and illegal. That I think raises the question of like, should we just be shutting down and phasing out the fossil fuel industry, getting rid of these wells, revegetating the areas, or if we give it to crypto mines, then that just gives the state a reason to keep these things around that I would argue that we don't need anymore. It creates a pressure group that is now somewhat dependent upon a kind of thing that you'd rather get rid of. Yeah,
but I mean, there are so many of these wells, and you're right that they're largely unregulated. And I think that what you're saying is all of these questions about, well, what should we actually be doing? Like, I think, you're saying that crypto mining is not the solution to any of these like bigger environmental problems that you want to consider and that you report on. And I think you're right. But I guess the question is like, are we even talking about crypto anymore? And like, what can these like 22-year-olds even do about what you're saying? Like, you're saying we need to regulate like flaring, yes. But like, what does that have to do? Does that are the existence of these, these entrepreneurs who are trying to lower the negative impact that is currently, like, are they really leading us all away from regulation? I mean, or do they really just have nothing to do with it, and there's a bigger problem that needs to be solved?
Well, but I mean, according to Alex, like if Bitcoin mining and crypto mining is doing the same amount of energy output as like the country of Argentina, then collectively that's a gigantic group of people.
Yeah.
And so the way things change, maybe not in Sweden, but in a lot of different places that have freer markets, is by a bunch of individuals who are motivated by their own self-interests, doing things in their self-interest that ultimately comes together to be in everyone's self-interest. Now, we might sit here and say that hasn't worked, and there's plenty of examples for that, but in Texas, that's the way it goes. And like, I'll say very personally, like, I have family in Texas, I have family who work in the energy industry in Texas, and they don't like regulations. They don't want it. They don't think that Texas should be like Sweden, and I think there's a lot of people in the United States who might agree with them on that. So thinking about crypto in that perspective, rather than let's solve the whole world through regulating everything, but through how do we incentivize individual actors to do things that might be in everyone's interest, doesn't crypto offer like some concept of a new generation of kids, as we call them, a new thing, I don't even know what it is, right? And a new frontier, which, I mean, it's an old frontier, it's Texas. That's my like, that's my sell for like, let's be a little optimistic here and not throw away the kids with our other concepts of how to solve this problem.
Yeah, I mean,
Silence, yeah, sorry.
I think the ultimate question of like, will Texas ever plug all of its old abandoned wells and like phase out the fossil fuel industry as the sort of like free market, like libertarian state that it is? The question of whether they're ever realistically going to do that is like crucial here, because probably not. Like, I think it would be foolish of me to think that that would ever happen. Do I hope for a world where like everything is, wind powered and regulated fairly by some authority? Maybe that is what would be better, but is that ever going to happen? No. So maybe we should just let individuals kind of fix the problem on kind of one-on-one circumstances. I do, however, think that it becomes kind of this same problem of like bridge fuels or bridge solutions, where it's like we have a short-term problem and a short-term solution, but that just creates dependency on that thing in the longer term, rather than, oh, we go through this growing pain now, but we transition to ultimately something that is better.
Yes, and that's in the President Biden's sort of energy plan, is like, let's liquefied natural gas as like a transition fuel. So this conversation is mirroring the larger conversation about what do we do about the fucking climate. But we are talking about crypto. So Alex, as I understand it, you're not particularly loved in the like Bitcoin mining community. Why is that? And like, talk to me about, I guess, like energy use per transaction and how, if we really look at that, all of this kind of falls away.
Yeah, I guess I'm not really loved because I'm exposing the energy use of this system. Hey, if you are a Bitcoin user, then normally you don't see the energy use. The miners are operating at the back end of the system. They're being paid by the software. They get 6.25 newly minted Bitcoins for every block they create. So the user isn't directly paying for that. Of course, they do get some fees, but that's only a small portion of the total money that goes to these miners. So from a user perspective, this is a hidden cost, and well, nowadays it's not so much anymore, thanks to my own Bitcoin energy consumption index and also the work of Cambridge, which have come up to their own electricity consumption index, which shows you just how much energy is used for this system, and probably even worse for them, how much energy is really being used for what's actually going on in the network. Because yes, it's using a lot of energy, but at the same time, Bitcoin is not really processing that many transactions, about 100 million a year. So if you average it down, you will see that the average Bitcoin transaction is consuming as much electrical energy as an average US household for a period of 2 months.
That sounds pretty bad. I imagine Bitcoin miners would push back and say like, well, you're cooking the numbers to make it look as bad as possible here. What do you say to that?
Well, you don't have to put in a lot of effort, apparently, in making it look bad. It's just that there is no way to make it look good. You have a carbon footprint of several hundreds of kilograms of carbon dioxide per single transaction as a result of the extreme energy intensity. A single Bitcoin transaction carries as much carbon dioxide as about 2 million Visa transactions. So in terms of efficiency, it's just performing terribly. And you don't have to put any special effort in making it look worse than that.
So we can think about the future and the innovation of individuals maybe to like capture carbon or methane or whatever, and it's all innovative. But what you're saying is like, just on a transactional basis, the amount of actual carbon being released due to this activity is as bad as it gets, basically.
Well, if you are going to calculate the carbon footprint of a Bitcoin transaction, you need to include whatever made that transaction happen. So that also means you have to include the carbon footprint of the block that was required to get the transaction processed in the first place. If there is no mining, there are no transactions. It's just that in the case of a Bitcoin transaction, it results in a very extreme number.
And that's a product of the fact that that's the way the algorithm is designed. That's the way this whole thing was put together.
Yes, Bitcoin has to be inefficient by design, because otherwise probably wouldn't work. It's not a bug, it's a feature, as they say. They're not wrong in that. This system is making useless computations for the ultimate purpose of keeping the system safe. And I have previously compared this to what was happening a year ago in Europe, when airlines were flying empty planes for the purpose of keeping their flight slots. Those flights had no purpose by themselves, but obviously they did have an ultimate purpose for the airline that was trying to keep their flight slots. And in that sense, you could say in a very abstract way, Bitcoin mining is comparable to that, because you constantly have miners generating completely useless computations for the ultimate purpose of securing the network.
Alice, like, what would a Bitcoin miner maybe say back to that?
I think that a lot of Bitcoin and crypto evangelists who I've spoken to say that they're being singled out, that a lot of industries have energy use that is larger than theirs. I mean, in Texas, one thing that Chad Harris, the CEO of this giant Bitcoin mining facility, told me is that, cryptocurrency is less than 2% of Texas energy use right now. He's saying that in defense.
That actually sounds like a lot.
That's exactly right. So it just kind of depends on how you see it. Like, if you see the existence of Bitcoin as being a thing that is transforming society and potentially helping a lot of people, then less than 2% sounds like nothing. If you see it as a way to speculate on basically a speculative asset that is making rich people richer, which is how a lot of other people see it, then less than 2% sounds like way too much.
Mm-hmm. No, but Alex, you said something that I think is really, we should key in on, which is like, most people who are hip to Bitcoin and crypto, who are trading it on Coinbase, who like have a wallet, who like talk about it at dinner parties or whatever, they don't mine this shit. Like, that's not what they do. They speculate, but they think it's a emerging source of value that we should all be paying attention to, because I can't explain it, but there's a new future here. So Alex, what you're saying is like the basis of this Bitcoin situation is bad for the environment by design. It's a feature, not a bug. What would you say then to, let's say, my uncle who just got into Bitcoin, like about his participation, which is like pretty minor, right? It's like a couple transactions or maybe even one a month or something, or just holding Bitcoin itself. Like, what would you say to someone who's just holding Bitcoin who says, yeah, sure, but that's like not my mine, not my problem?
Well, if you are in some way contributing to the system, then that means that you are also responsible partially, even if it's for a small part, for the ultimate emissions of that system. And hey, if you're buying and holding, you are, even if you're not doing transactions, you did buy into Bitcoin, you did, for a small part, do your bit in pushing up the Bitcoin price, which is ultimately what drives very closely the environmental impact of the system, because every dollar the Bitcoin price goes up means that the miners in the back end are making more money, which means also a bigger incentive to get more machines, and ultimately those machines will have a bigger environmental impact. You can also turn that around, by the way. You could also say if the Bitcoin price is zero, the environmental impact of Bitcoin would be zero, because the miners, the value of the Bitcoin they would be mining would be zero, so they would never be able to pay any electricity bills at all, or any machines for that matter.
So then, by the libertarian ethos that like binds together the crypto community, our individual actions, if we want to take responsibility for them and say like, hey, let's save the planet and shit, then like what you're saying, Alex, is like you're part of the problem, not part of the solution, even if it's a minor bit.
But does your uncle drive a car?
Yeah.
So why are we even talking about his Bitcoin holdings?
Well, because if everything is, crypto folks want a revolution, right? Like, they don't want fiat currencies doing the world anymore. They want all of us doing the world. So it's the beginnings of a new world. So we have to be involved with it, even if there's externalities at the beginning that aren't perfect yet. That's what I would say.
Yeah, I think, like, I'm not saying that it's not worth talking about. We're all here talking about it. I'm just kind of, I think that's the other side, is sort of like, is this really the biggest problem we have to solve?
No, it's not, but it's representative maybe of the conversations about how to solve some of the biggest problems we have. Do we solve it through cool innovations? Or do we solve it through like a concerted collective effort to like regulate out the bad guys? So to that end, and I think this is the big, for people paying attention to the conversation, the big elephant in the room, Bitcoin, proof of work. That's not the only way to make a cryptocurrency on a blockchain function. And if we can take Alex's word for it and the research that he's done, the way that this proof of work concept has played out is net negative for our environment. So I guess the first thing I want to ask is, what the fuck is proof of work? And then what is this other thing that people talk about, proof of stake? Alex, I'm going to let you do this because I hear you have a great explanation.
Yes, well, in proof of work, what you're doing is you're just adding computational power so that you have a bigger chance of winning this block mining lottery. And the more computational power you have just means that there is a bigger chance you get to create the next block for the blockchain. And why do you want that? Well, you get a reward for every block that you make. Now, if you switch that to these alternatives that are out there, the most popular one being proof of stake, but it's not the only alternative, then you change it around in the sense that you keep the lottery because you need that, but your chance of winning doesn't depend on how much computational power you have, rather it depends on how much wealth you have in the system. So if we're talking about Bitcoins, if Bitcoin was running on proof of stake, then it would just be based on how many Bitcoins you own. And then that would be how you participate in the block creation process, and you get a certain amount of interest for it rather than having newly created coins for your computational work. Now, the biggest gain with that is that you only need a device with an internet connection. That device can be anything that has sufficient computer chips to run a wallet. So a Raspberry Pi would be sufficient. A Raspberry Pi consumes about 5 watts. Or 5 to 15 watts, somewhere in that range, extremely little compared to a miner which does 3 kilowatts easily.
Sorry, what is a Raspberry Pi? Are we talking about like the actual Pi itself?
Sorry, a Raspberry Pi is just a mini computer.
Okay.
It's a pretty cool device, and you can easily get a few of those if you want. But they're pretty fun to toy around with. But yeah, you can put a wallet on there. I saw a calculation last week that said if Ethereum, the second largest cryptocurrency of the moment, which is running mining like Bitcoin, proof of work, would switch to proof of stake, which is something that they're planning to do, they could save 99.93% of their current energy consumption. And it wouldn't really change much other than the backend just requires less energy. And of course, the proponents of proof of work will argue, well, yeah, okay, but it's a completely different security situation, and they're not wrong about that. But if we park that for now, because there's the proof of work by itself also has sufficient security challenges. At least from an environmental perspective, this is a great solution because you get rid of almost the entire energy need.
Okay, so if I'm at like, shooting the shit with my buddies, my takeaway from this would be like the blockchain cryptocurrency world of today isn't going to be the blockchain cryptocurrency world of 20 years. Same way that like the internet that we use today isn't the internet of 20 years ago. So we're at a foundational stage where Bitcoin and this proof of work concept is what is hegemonic, is what's dominating the industry, but we're going to move away from it. And so this conversation about how much energy it's being used is like talking about IP protocols 20 years ago that no one knows anymore. So what is it that's keeping, I guess if we ask the question, what is it that's keeping proof of work around? But the way I would ask the question is like, is Bitcoin now so big as far as what it takes up as the crypto landscape and so inertia holding that it's inhibiting new ideas like the Ethereum idea, like the proof of stake or whatever, the proof of whatever it's going to be next, to penetrate into people's ideas of how crypto is created, to ultimately solve the environment problem. Because to me, it's like, so long as there's proof of work and it's based on computational power, there's going to be an energy question behind it. And unless we get cold fusion and like perfect energy solutions, that's always going to be there. So the next step is thinking about what comes next after proof of work and what's keeping proof of work as the dominant force today. So that's my big question that I wonder what you guys think about. Audrey, I'll go to you first.
Sure, yeah. I mean, I would, Alex, correct me if I'm wrong on this, but I think there are a lot of people who are in the crypto space who are really intrigued by newer coins and proof of stake coins because they're just more affordable. Like Bitcoin's really hard to get into right now because it's so valuable, or it just doesn't make financial sense for people. So I don't know if Bitcoin's dominance is necessarily the thing that's going to hold this back. But I think the environmental impact is still not nothing though, because even if we completely move away from these big, these big warehouses that are full of these ASICs, these specialized computers, what happens when we don't need them anymore? Do they just stay there? Like that's a lot of waste, a lot of infrastructure, and it comes back to that same question of like, what do we do with all these old oil wells? It's like, what do we do with this legacy of this industry that once was that's just crashed? Are we just gonna leave this shit here to like continue being waste? That's not. I don't think that's nothing.
Mm-hmm. Right, so these are the problems of today.
It's a sunk cost, though. It's kind of like it's too late because all of these resources already exist.
Yeah.
But it's the same problem. We're trying to get ourselves off of fossil fuels, right? But we need a transition fuel to do it, to get to renewables. But the industry is weighed down by a reliance on fossil fuels because I need to fly to Amsterdam tomorrow, and I'm not going to do it on a fucking electric jet. I'm going to do it on a regular jet. So like, we're talking about what the future could look like in crypto without proof of work because of computational power, and we're still cycling the same inertial problems that fossil fuel represents in our economy today.
Yeah, but I think I feel like, well, I don't know. What do you think, Alex? Do you think the adoption of proof of stake, what are the challenges there? Because in my mind, it's easier to adopt than something like, well, transitioning our entire economy off of fossil fuels.
True.
The key challenge is that if you are trying to migrate a distributed network like Bitcoin to a new software version, is that there is nobody in charge that can push that upgrade. That's a key strength of the network, but also means that it's very rigid, and there is just nobody that can say, as of tomorrow, we're gonna run proof of stake, because nobody has that authority. The only one that has that authority is every individual participant in the network themselves. So if you wanna make this upgrade happen, someone needs to prepare it, and then every participant individually needs to decide to start running it, and ideally all at the exact same time, because otherwise you risk splitting the network, which is something that actually happened in Bitcoin before. That's why we now have Bitcoin and Bitcoin Cash, for different reasons, by the way, but that was also a sort of attempted upgrade which didn't really work out. So this is a major challenge in any blockchain system. You need to get everyone convinced that you need to do this, and you need to manage it properly so that it happens at the same time. That's where the key challenges are, and especially when you have a community that is for a big part reluctant to make a change, you are facing a very difficult problem, because if part of the community does not upgrade, you will just get another Bitcoin and Bitcoin Cash situation where you have a potential split in the network and suddenly potentially creating two currencies coming from the exact same one.
First of all, what's the problem with that? Sorry, I want to interrupt, but what's the problem with that? Because like the Catholic Church split, and we're sitting here today, like we're fine. Like, I don't see that as a huge problem. And the reason I want to ask that question is specifically, like, isn't there like a Bitcoin mining council? Aren't there like some ways that people are organizing themselves to think about regulating towards the future in that way, so that, you know, the federal government doesn't say, hi, we just got hip to the calculation you did, Alex, about like kilograms of carbon in the atmosphere per transaction, and we're going to ban Bitcoin mining now. So like, how is the industry? What's that?
What China did.
What China did, exactly. And maybe not for China's reasons, for America's reasons, who knows? But like, what is the energy within the Bitcoin mining community to get ahead of this problem?
Well, the energy is they're trying to spread a message that makes it sound better than it is, because in all honesty, there isn't that much you can do to change the course of what's happening in the Bitcoin network. And that's simply because miners are, well, the Bitcoin mining market is really simplistic. It's an extremely competitive market where only the ones with access to the cheapest and most constant available energy can survive. So, there is no, you typically can't afford the luxury to care about the environment in such a way where you shut down your operations for half the day, because your competition will be running 24/7 and making a lot more money than you, which means that you have to do the exact same thing as well, otherwise you're out. Of course, you can do something externally. Like if you want this industry to move to renewables, for example, then you can say, okay, you know what, I'm gonna subsidize renewable energy for this industry to make it more attractive for them to be using renewables. But then you get the question of, like, should we be using taxpayer money to subsidize a already quite profitable industry? And the profit margins of some miners right now are in the 90% range. So that's also not a very appealing idea to many. There's been a lot of talk about natural incentives for this industry to use renewables as well. They're saying, well, you know what, renewables are becoming the cheapest energy source, but people tend to forget that, okay, yes, renewables can be very cheap, but miners want power 24/7, ideally, simply because that's the best way to maximize their profits. If you have a machine running for a full day on, let's say, coal-based energy from Kentucky, you are probably going to make a lot more money than putting those machines in Texas, running them on solar or wind for half the day and then shutting down for the other half, simply because, if you have a profit margin of 90% either way, then the little bit extra you can earn with just a little bit cheaper energy for part of the day is not going to make you want to be shutting down for half the day. So, I wouldn't expect too much from the industry itself. They can disclose more of what they're actually using in terms of renewable energy versus fossil fuel energy. But, then the next thing you would wonder is, okay, what are you going to do about it? And that's where you're typically going to get stuck, because if a governments decide, okay, you know what, this is too much, we don't want this anymore, they can start levying a carbon tax or something like that. But then, that will have the same effect as the Chinese mining ban had recently, which is that these miners will just move to another location and then start using energy over there.
It starts to sound a lot like global corporate finance too, right? Like you tax, the EU brings their corporate tax rate down, so everyone moves their corporations elsewhere. So I guess what I'm getting from this is that there's a lot of highfalutin talk about the values of a libertarian crypto land world, but really when you put all that stuff away, it comes down to a highly competitive market of really motivated actors trying to do whatever they can to get ahead and make the most money possible.
And sometimes that is using low-cost renewables, and sometimes it isn't.
Right.
That's kind of what it boils down to. It's really about the price of the energy.
So then, okay, this is a dumb question, then I have a very simple question. The dumb question is, if I'm go on Coinbase and I'm I want to buy a little bit of Bitcoin, can I ask Coinbase or anyone to buy a Bitcoin that was mined with renewable energy?
I don't think so.
That's just a basic, because we're told as consumers to switch to renewable sources of your energy, buy local. There's all these things that we as individual people are supposed to do to make the world a better place. A cryptocurrency enthusiast can't do that on their own. So we're talking about it has to start from the people making the coin.
There's no ESG option, I think, on Coinbase.
That's the easiest way.
Yeah, because you're buying from another person who owns Bitcoin. You're not buying from a miner, right? So they can't track that. Is that right, Alex?
They probably could track it, but I don't think they do.
You can mark coins, and I think there's some initiatives working on this very idea right now. And by the way, there's been a lot.
I just had that idea, by the way. Sorry, Alex, continue.
There's been a lot of efforts this year to do something about the ESG friendliness of Bitcoin overall. There's even been a crypto exchange that started buying carbon offsets for their carbon footprint to obviously offset the impact they have on the world. And also earlier this year, we saw a lot of the Bitcoin or the crypto industry stakeholders signed the Crypto Climate Agreement, which is a commitment to use 100% renewable energy by 2030. Now that, by the way, doesn't have any compliance mechanisms embedded, so nothing to enforce it. But I think it definitely shows that this is becoming, the industry participants are becoming aware that they have to do something about it, and this is a very recent process. So we still have to see how this is going to develop further.
Okay, so that's a marketplace solution to a marketplace problem. My simple question is, should Bitcoin mining be regulated by the U.S. federal government because of the carbon emissions that are tied to it?
Yeah, the problem is there's only so much you can do with regulation. And China did ban crypto mining altogether. And you can ultimately replicate something like that in the US, or you can start levying a carbon tax to have a little less drastic solution, but still will impact the industry heavily. But ultimately, cryptocurrency mining is location independent, so you might solve the problem for the US, but climate change is a global problem, so we also need to look at this from a global perspective. It's not enough to ban cryptocurrency mining in China. It's not enough to do something about cryptocurrency mining in the US. This is something that you need to tackle from a joint perspective, all the countries in the world, because it can happen everywhere. And then even if every country would decide to take some kind of action on cryptocurrency mining, then still it's not enough, because you can only really target industrial miners. It's very easy to target large-scale industrial-size miners because you can't hide a massive facility full of machines, and it just takes too much power to be hidden. But if we ban those everywhere, then people will just start putting those machines inside their own houses. Well, good luck with that. So then the only alternative is an even more drastic option, which is you would have to consider doing something that maybe drags down the value of Bitcoin rather than specifically targeting the Bitcoin mining. Because if the Bitcoin price is zero, again, the environmental impact of the system is zero. So if you perhaps prohibit people from investing their money in the asset, that would be enough to damage the value of Bitcoin and as a result reduce the environmental impact. But of course, you run into the same problem you have with trying to ban mining everywhere, which is that there will probably be plenty of countries that will still allow for trading in Bitcoin. So it is really a extremely difficult problem to tackle from a policy perspective. I think that the biggest chance of success would actually come if the second largest cryptocurrency of the moment, Ethereum, which is planning to move to proof of stake, actually succeeds in that. And if that subsequently attracts, let's say, a lot of investors to this cryptocurrency over Bitcoin, because everyone's like, okay, we don't want to invest in this polluting currency anymore. We're all going to invest only in this cryptocurrency that has a more sustainable algorithm, then it's becoming more likely that the Bitcoin community, if they manage to stay relevant, would consider making a similar change to their software. And I think that's the only real solution to the carbon emissions of this system. If you want to get it reduced, the best change needs to come from within. And well,
let's talk about the best change coming from within, because even within the Bitcoin community, there are miners who are pushing to green the grid, right? I mean, that's something that you saw, Alice. Like, what do we make of that?
Yeah, I mean, I rarely met anybody in my reporting who literally said, I don't care about the environment at all. Everyone says that they are thinking about it. It's just that the impression I got is that some of them are thinking of their profits first, right? First they want to grow, first they want to scale, first they want to become profitable, and then they want to kind of change their energy makeup. But I wonder about, Alex, what you've just been saying about different ways to potentially regulate this. Is the real way to potentially regulate this just to move our entire grid more towards renewables, which we're already doing? And then would this even necessarily be a problem? Because if the power that they're drawing to mine is coming from renewable sources, it seems to me like some of the issues get naturally resolved. I, of course, recognize that that's going to take a long time to do.
Everyone you talked to was cognizant of the environmental challenges at play, and I'm sure they're cognizant of what Alex is saying about how much carbon comes out of Bitcoin mining. And yes, if we move our entire grid to renewables, this isn't a problem anymore, but that's not going to happen anytime soon. So individual actors-wise, like, do you believe that the spirit of the industry is such that it could potentially help tip people, to, policymakers towards more green solutions to an energy grid, period?
That's exactly what they say they're trying to do. They say a lot of people who are doing cryptocurrency in Texas specifically say that they're actually incentivizing the move towards renewables. And I'm honestly not sure if that's true or not. I think I do see in individual cases that the way that mining is being done, where they are specifically setting up their operation to only be drawing from renewables, I'm more convinced by those individual operations, but I don't think that they're representative of the whole Bitcoin mining community in Texas, and certainly not of the world. So I think that it's hard for me to know, how much these individual people who do seem to be trying to do the right thing are really reflective of the broader industry.
Sure. But it is important to highlight those stories because maybe someone else thinks that's a good way of doing it too. Because my basic concept here is that this is a new world, right? And yes, of course, it's like reliant on the old world in very specific material ways. But the more the good shit is like out there, the more it might inspire people to go on that side of things.
And it doesn't even have to be always there. Like, basically, the profit incentives can sometimes jive with the incentive to use renewables, right? So the one example I'm thinking of is an operation that is actually using natural gas that would otherwise be flared, and they're using it to power a generator and actually mining Bitcoin off of that. And so in that case, they describe it as a win-win because the power that they're getting is close to free, because this is considered waste by this 100-year-old oil well that they're getting it from, and and then also the emissions are still there but lower than they would be if this mining operation didn't exist at this place.
So there is examples of miners trying to push towards green either through using renewables or recycling effectively.
Yeah, definitely. And there's people who are doing wind farms. And kind of saying that they want to use the energy that's not being used by homes and businesses at night because there's more wind than is produced, and we don't currently have enough storage or transmission lines to actually get the energy to where it needs. So in that case, you can see a use case for a Bitcoin mine. At the same time, it's not necessarily, It's using wasted energy. What is it contributing? That's another question. But I think the question of is this actively harming is more easily answerable, where it doesn't seem like it's actively harming the situation. Unless, I think you probably have something to say about that. Maybe you disagree.
I think whether this is actively a harmful thing does ultimately come down to whether you see cryptocurrency as a value add to society or not. I think what I would be I think that when it comes to green coins, which are emerging, there are coins that are explicitly this is an environmentally friendly coin, the same way that you have environmentally friendly stock you can invest in ESGs.
Like Dogecoin, you just have to push it and it becomes a pyramid scheme, but then also ultimately people start using, renewables to make their shit.
Yeah. I would just be conscientious of greenwashing though in those areas, because it's if you're mining a Bitcoin off of a wind farm, then that's zero emissions. But if you are mining a Bitcoin off of fossil fuels and, like buying a carbon offset somewhere, which is like a notoriously tricky to regulate industry, notoriously kind of a greenwashing thing that these things are, it's like we buy these offsets and that gets us to our net zero, but nobody really knows where they go. And they go to these carbon sinks that, allegedly build up forests that just then get burned down in forest fires every summer because of our worsening climate crisis. Like that's not, I think there are a lot of people who would say that that is a false solution. And I think because there's natural incentive for green coins because there's a market there, there's people who would only want to buy green coins, but then you would get a lot of people entering that space who are kind of lying about what they're doing. The same way you have, like most traditional kind of stocks now are like veering towards green things, and fossil fuel companies are saying that they're using green solutions. And I would just be conscientious of greenwashing in this realm in that same way.
Right. Okay, so I guess I would be counted among the folks who would want a green coin. I think like what I've learned from talking to you and watching your piece is like it's a huge deal that Bitcoin is as valuable as it is, as popular as it is in the marketplace, but then as bad as it is to the environment. So my big question at the end, and like maybe this is a yes or no question, maybe it's not, is like, is mining Bitcoin worth it? When we consider the promises of a new world based on a decentralized, ledger-based cryptocurrency versus the shit capitalism we have today, is the externality of Bitcoin mining and its carbon emissions worth the promise of tomorrow? I think I know what Alex's answer is, so I'm going to start with you, Alice.
I actually don't know, and I think that question is really central to everything we've been talking about today, because the questions about energy use could be more or less important based on what the energy is being used for. And right now, when I see how cryptocurrency is currently being used, to me, it seems like the semi-utopian promises haven't been fulfilled yet. So that leads me to think that, that could lead one to think that maybe we shouldn't be doing this if it hasn't happened yet. At the same time, do I think it has potential? I actually do. So I think I'm undecided.
Audrey?
I don't think it is. I think it's not worth it. I think that the number of instances and potential instances in which crypto mines allow for the continuance of fossil fuel infrastructure and coal plants and coal plants that were going to die that then get a mine attached to them and stay alive. I just don't think we have time for that from an environmental perspective. And I get that there are uses of cryptocurrency that are beneficial. I get that, but from an environmental perspective, I just really don't think we have time for this weird thing that's happening. That's like keeping all of these power plants running. I just don't think, yeah.
Alex, what's your perspective on this?
Well, the thing is that there is probably a niche use case for all of this, in the sense that if you think about where do you want to run a currency that doesn't need a government or financial intermediaries, there's probably plenty of countries with, let's say, financial systems that aren't working well, potentially corrupt governments. Those are areas where you can maybe make use of this, but at the same time, those places are typically also low income countries, and the difficulty is that the Bitcoin network and actually most cryptocurrency networks just don't scale. So the moment they get very popular, in the case of Bitcoin, the network just gets congested and people will pay more than $50 per transaction on average just to get a transaction through on the network. If you're living in a country where you're making $2,500 a year, that's just not a viable option. So then the question is, where are you going to use this system instead? Well, there aren't that many valid use cases elsewhere, simply because in our, let's say, more developed world, we tend to trust our financial institutions. We don't really need a decentralized system that much, and most people are putting their money in Bitcoin simply because they expect the value of Bitcoin to go up. They expect to make money, but not because they're trying to do payments or anything like that. It's probably too expensive to do it. And unfortunately, that's not going to get any better either because, like I said, these systems don't scale. Bitcoin will probably never be able to handle much more than 7 transactions per second because it has a 1 megabyte of data per block limit. If you add 1 megabyte of data to the Bitcoin blockchain every 10 minutes, that translates to a maximum of 7 transactions per second. And people don't want to increase that limit because in order to keep the system accessible, you have to ensure that it doesn't grow in size exponentially. You don't want to have a Bitcoin blockchain that is 100 terabytes in size, because then it would forgo the original purpose of the system, which is that people can just download the Bitcoin software, put it on their computer, and have their own wallet in their own house and being independent from financial intermediaries. This is, by the way, the reason why we have Bitcoin and Bitcoin Cash nowadays. This is a very fundamental discussion where people in the past did try to, get the Bitcoin network to upgrade its transaction capacity. And while that is not happening, it just means that we will not be able to use this system as a large-scale payment system. We will not be able to use it as a global currency because it just doesn't have the capacity to do that. The Bitcoin network does 100 million transactions a year. That's pretty close to what it can handle at maximum. The global financial system does something like 700 billion electronic payments a year. So Bitcoin can do at max 0.02% of that, and that's it. In the same time, the global financial system is probably already using less energy than the Bitcoin network. If we look at Bitcoin network, it's consuming more electrical energy than a country like Argentina. It's also pretty close to what all data centers in the world are currently consuming. And when I talk about all data centers, then that includes the data centers that are supporting our traditional financial infrastructure, but also everything else that requires a data center. So social media, this conversation, the internet itself, everything else. If that's the situation where there is just not much possible practical use, but there is a very large energy impact, then my verdict would be that's absolutely not worth it.
But I think it's important to say that Bitcoin is not the only cryptocurrency, and that a lot of the problems that we're calling out could potentially have solutions coming from within the community and within the industry, like in the very near future. Mm-hmm. So I think we should have this conversation again in like a year.
And that's my verdict is gotta break some eggs to make an omelet, and we've just broken a bunch of eggs and we're whipping the omelet up right now. And maybe 10 and 15 years, the concepts that we're trying out in a crypto blockchain world will be refined by way of regulation in some senses, by way of individual innovation in other senses, and by way of the world spirit taking us towards a perfect utopia where nothing matters anymore. So thank you guys for joining me today. I know I learned that if you're participating in a crypto blockchain, pay attention to the externalities, pay attention to the environmental costs, because it's all of our problems. Thank you again, guys, for joining me. That's it for us today. We'll see you next time.